There's definitely room for the standing in front of the room and teaching a class to people. There is information that people need, but if they just get the information, they're just going to get fat heads, right? Their heads are too fat, and really the Lord wants, you got to have time where you can go make sure their heart's connecting to that information, and make sure they're growing in their skill set and their competency, so that they're being prepared for the God to use them in certain ways.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. This podcast is all about church planting in the Canadian context. So whether you are a church planter, pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or someone just wanting to learn more about Canadian church planting, we believe this podcast is for you. We pray this is a blessing to you, and if it is, we would ask you to share links to episodes, subscribe on whatever platform you're using. With that, let's get to our next conversation. Welcome, friends, to the Sowers Podcast. Thanks for joining us for another conversation and another episode that will hopefully inspire you to become a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. And so whether you are listening on your commute, whether you're listening on a run, doing some other form of exercise, whether you're on your bike, wherever you might be, it is a gift to have you with us today. As always, if this podcast has been an encouragement to you, maybe this is your first episode, but we would love if you would go ahead and share this episode or rate us on whatever platform you are using. These are some of the best ways that you can actually get the word out about this podcast and hopefully be part of inspiring others to become sowers of the gospel in the places where they live, work, learn, and play. Well, today you're going to hear a conversation that I had with Earl Marshall. Earl is the director of the Great Commission Collective. He's had many years of pastoring, of leading in seminary environments. And so Earl and I talk a lot about elder development and training, which has been a consistent theme over the last little while. He also talks about the importance of elders and leaders in a church actually spending time to build relationship with one another, so that when you hit a season or a time of conflict, that you have the relationship is as the foundation to actually be able to make it through that challenging season of conflict. I think you're going to be encouraged, challenged, equipped, inspired. And so without further ado, here is my conversation with Earl Marshall. Well, Earl, thank you for taking the time today to be part of the Sowers Podcast. It's a real privilege to have this conversation and get to reflect with you a bit on your journey. Would you share for us, Earl, where you were when God gripped your heart? How did you become a follower of Jesus?
Yeah, first of all, great to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity to, just share a little bit about my life. It was pretty much a journey for me. So my mom and dad came to know Christ probably in their late teens, early 20s. My mom's mom died when she was 10 years old, so she didn't really have a significant mother figure to follow after. My dad's dad was challenging too, so they both kind of didn't have mentors in parenting, and then I came along, so fascinating. Grew up in Mimico area, downtown, near the downtown area in Toronto, and then we moved to Malton, to Mississauga. And while I was there, I think at 7 years old, my mom decided she wanted to run a backyard Bible club for our neighborhood. And so I went with her door to door, and we kind of invited all my friends to come to this thing that I had no idea what it was. And then this woman from CEF, Child Evangelism Fellowship, came and she shared the gospel to us. And that's when I remembered the idea of, I can remember really clearly, Christ came, he died for my sins. She gave a gospel call to that, and I responded and said, that's what I need, and that kind of started the journey. I do think that was my conversion experience, but it's been very much a journey process. I would say the real gripping of my heart took place in my late teens. I grew up in a really small Baptist church. It's still in existence in Malton, and the people there loved me and they cared for me. They were amazing. And I can remember we had a part-time youth sponsor from one of the Bible colleges came, and he was interacting with me in my late teens and said, "Hey, you should think about ministry." And I said, "I think you're nuts," kind of idea. And I went off to the University of Waterloo. I was there my first year. I had a terrible experience there. Just not satisfied with where my life was at. And I started to ask some deeper questions about what I would be doing for the rest of my life. And the Lord really started to press in on me and where my heart was at. And I went to a college age, university age student event, and the speaker was talking about Peter the Rock and talking about giving our lives to ministry. And they had this altar call, and I came to the front. I thought everybody in the room was going to come to the front, and I turned around. There was like 6 of us at the front, and that's where God really gripped my heart, like a sense of less about like a call to ministry, more about, Earl, your life needs to count for me. And so that started this amazing journey of me thinking about what it is that God wants to do with my life, how I should, Romans 12, 1 and 2, how I need to worship the Lord with everything that I have. So that was the beginning of that.
What was sort of the state of the church in Canada at the time? What was going on around you and where you were living and in local churches?
I remember the state of the church being fairly positive. I mean, small. I'm 62 now. I don't ever remember a time when the evangelical footprint was large in Canada. It was always small. There were no large churches. They were small. Most of them were just smaller churches. And, but our youth ministry was good. I found it fairly easy to interact with non-believers at that time as I was growing up. So the state of it was, I think it was part of the culture, not really, not an overly emphasis on being distinct or separate.
Yeah, I suppose the reason I ask is, at this time of you kind of coming to the front of at that event and kind of going, I want my life to count. Was there at least an imagination at the time and examples of pastors around that you could go, hey, that's an example to me, at least of what's around, of what it might look like?
Yeah, for sure. And it looks a lot different then than it does now, for sure. But yeah, there were men and women that I would have aspired to be like, for sure. I think even in my context, a small church context that I grew up in, I had ample opportunities as a 14-year-old. Like, our pastor would grab me on Sunday mornings and say, I want you to read this scripture from the Bible on, I remember hiding in the washroom, hoping that he would not find me. So because of the size and the kind of community it was, there was a really, you got to do things that many people don't get to do now. So it was pretty cool. And you get to know people, right? You got to know all the older people in the church, and they had an amazing, amazing impact on my life.
So from there, did you do some theological education? What was kind of then the development plan towards the pastoral work and pastoral vocation?
Yeah, so I attended one of the schools that became Heritage Seminary. And while I was there, that's where I started to form convictions around moving into pastoral ministry. It's interesting. One of the things that the year that I was at University of Waterloo, helped me with was I was in the co-op program at the University of Waterloo. So I took that concept with me into my education experience when I was in London. And I said, I told myself, okay, if you're headed into pastoral ministry, every summer you need to go and serve at a church. So I did that for my undergrad for the four summers. So I would apply for an internship, or I beg some guy to take me on. And my dad was really helpful with me. He said, like, don't worry about what they're going to pay you. He said, just ask them if you can raise money on the side. And so I did that. And I never had, like, I was able to pay for my whole year of school and never had any debt at the end. And I got all this experience. I mean, massive amounts of experience. Because again, most of the churches I served in were a smaller size. And so I remember as a 20-year-old, like, preaching multiple messages at a church. I mean, I reflect back on that and I go, man, like, it's just, that's the ultimate experiment, right? Like letting a 20-year-old who really doesn't know that much.
But such a powerful testimony
yeah.
to the pastors and the leaders of those churches at that point to say, hey, we want to invest in the next generation. We want to help somebody cut their teeth. Fast forward with me a little bit. You then served in a couple of churches, maybe a few churches. Share with us a couple of those places that you served and how God continued to form you and your leadership.
Yeah, so after I graduated seminary, after I did my MDiv, I actually started working at Heritage Seminary. So I spent 14 years there and served in multiple churches at the same time. For the most part, I was basically pastoring college students for those 14 years. And then I left there and I went to Orangeville and served at a church there, and got to see the church grow and establish and move from not small but smaller to larger, and experiencing those kinds of things. That had a real profound influence on me. But in both cases, when I left the seminary and then after 13 years at the church, I felt like a really strong call of God. Okay, your time's done here. And so in both of those cases, we just basically, Brenda and I, we prayed about it and just came to the conclusion, it's time to leave. Let's resign and trust the Lord that he'll give us something else. So that's had a significant impact on us and how we process decisions together and what risk looks like and things like that. So it's been a really helpful experience for us. Then we left that and then got involved here at Hope here at this church.
So I'm just thinking about, you just mentioned risk, the profound impact upon marriage. How do you manage risk and walk with your wife and your family, your kids at the time, through this risk?
I wish I could say I did it well. Prayerfully, for sure, with lots of discussion. When we left the seminary to go to the church in Orangeville, my daughter was going into grade 8 and my son was going into grade 9. So there's really no good time to uproot your family and start over. But that was a delicate season for them. And so walking through that and trying to help, we just had to spend a lot of time with our kids through the transition. We talked a lot with them and discussed it. There wasn't a vote system for sure, but we definitely were working through that. Then when we were deciding to leave the church, our kids were gone now. They were already married, but Brenda and I basically, I think it took us about a year to make that decision. So we prayed a lot. We talked a lot about it. We had seasons where we decided, okay, we're not going to talk about it, right? And let's just see if the Lord's really still in this. So we went through that, the ups and downs of that, and kind of working and just trusted that the Lord was with us and he was directing our paths. We talked to other people who gave us good insight. And then ultimately we just felt the burning passion to have to move on to do something else. So, and we did.
Part of the journey for you has been in sort of higher education environments. You talked about Heritage, and then in some sense you were down in Chicago helping Harvest at the time with their training and education of, I think it was pastors. What are some of the staples of training? I'm thinking about the pastors and leaders that are listening to the podcast right now, and they're thinking about, okay, I need to get some training. What would you say are some of the staples in either of those environments? As you were talking to students, as you were talking to pastors getting trained, what were some of the most important things that they were learning and repeatedly giving testimony to? I'm really glad we spent time focusing on that.
The two environments are a little bit different. The seminary was more taking what I would say students from the very beginning of the process to an end process. So it was very clearly defined. In Chicago, we were working with people who had already graduated from seminary and they were getting ready to do like church planting. So I think in that environment, in the church planting, training church planters, I have felt the things that were real, that people walk away with was there's a relational component that a lot of organizations downplay. So planters or people who are going into like startup kind of things, it can be very lonely. It can be very exhausting. They need a sense that they're part of a broader family and a broader team. And so one of the things I loved about what we were able to do is we actually ministered to the whole family. So we would bring them in, minister to the whole family. They would all experience the same things together, whether it was content they were giving or experiences that they were gaining. And then when they left, they went their ways to other places, but they were always in contact with each other. So there was a very strong kind of connection with them. I think that has done them well over the years, so they can continue to lean on one another and encourage one another. So it's been really, really helpful. I mean, there's always the actual content that you need to be given. So whether you need good theology, but you also have to have the experiences too, right? So as I found in my own life, like it's one thing to have head knowledge, it's another thing to have what I call like street knowledge, or like the ministry abilities, skills, the competencies. Like many of our churches, we're weighted more on giving the intellectual or head kind of information, and we need to realize that it is as much of a heart thing as well as a skill thing as well. So I found that the combination of those three things to be really helpful. So yes, there's things we need to know, but then there's this mentoring or coaching piece where you can actually help the person go after their character and their heart. And then the other piece is just having the right kinds of experiences. So that's kind of, I mean, in every environment I've been in, it's always been about those three pieces. How do we do that? And so even now, as I reflect back on how my experiences over the years and how that first church really pushed into my life, in many ways because of my experience when I was younger, I try to model the ministry that I have now over those same kinds of experiences. So whether it's training church planters, or whether it's a discipleship ministry here in our church, in the church here, or working with young leaders, I get the privilege to continue to do that now. I'm always thinking about those three pieces, like what do they need to know, what do they need to be able to do, and then what's going on in their heart, and those three things interfacing with one another.
Share with us how you've done that in the discipleship context of here at Hope Bible Church here in Oakville. How have you tried to making disciple environments that has an element to each of those three things? I'm just thinking about those that might be listening and they're pastoring or leading their churches, or they're part of the church, and they're thinking, okay, how do I incorporate those three things into the day-to-day life of the discipleship environment in our church?
My major focus here has been on trying to help cultivate an environment for younger leaders or potential leaders. So people who are saying, I think God might be leading me in this kind of direction. What do I need to do? At the same time, we were able to start this institute here that in a broad way allowed us to go a little bit deeper in probably a more knowledge-based thing. So like how to study the Bible, a basic Bible doctrine, or what's the Old Testament about, what's the New Testament about, like things like that. Or we bring in speakers like, we bring other profs from other seminaries to come in and do a one-day thing or something like that. I mean, we're able to do that because of the size of our church, but any church can do that. Like, when I was pastoring, I used to meet with Saturday mornings, and I would take as crude as this sounds, I took one of our systematic theology books, bought them each a copy, and said, okay, we're going to meet this week, we're going to study, read pages 1 to 8, and then we're going to talk about it when we get together. Right? So doing that, like the knowledge piece is really important. Like, people need to know doctrine. They need to understand what they believe and why they believe it. So that's really important. That's probably even more important in the culture in which we're living in. Like, we're constantly confronted with opposite message to what the truth of Scripture is teaching. So people need to they have to know that. They need to understand that. So you have to do that. But it's not enough. Okay, so I think then like I think about the Monday night group of guys that I meet with right now. There's 10 of us that meet, and I mean, all we do is we just open Scripture every time we get together. We're going through the pastoral epistles, kind of working through that, and then it's like, then we spend a lot of time talking about heart questions related to that text. So when Paul's talking about Timothy here, kind of, and he's saying this to him, like, how does that impact your heart, kind of idea? And we're kind of working through those things. Or in my one-on-one conversations with those guys, I'm doing that. And then also giving them some opportunities to try things out. Like starting in April, in a couple of months, we're going to be doing preaching lab, right? These guys all sense that God's calling them into ministry. So I said, okay, well, we'll do a preaching lab, right? And we'll see where you're at, kind of idea, and do those things. So I don't know how to operate outside of that system. Like, I think it's not like there's definitely room for the standing in front of the room and teaching a class to people. There is information that people need, but if they just get the information, they're just going to get fat heads, right? Their heads are too fat, and really the Lord wants, you got to have time where you can go make sure their heart's connecting to that information, and make sure they're growing in their skill set and their competencies, so that they're being prepared for the God to use them in certain ways.
Friends, we'll get back to my interview with Earl Marshall in just a minute. Prior to that, however, I want to let you know about Great Commission Collective Canada. Planting churches, strengthening leaders. The GCC is a diverse collective of churches resourcing and supporting church planting around the world. The GCC believes that the mission is much larger than one church, but that each church is vital. GCC is eager to understand you and your church, where you are and where you are headed, and then help you get there. They believe that they are stronger together, and that church planting is difficult, but that we can do more together. If you want to learn more about the Great Commission Collective Canada, you can visit gccollective.ca. Once again, that's gccollective.ca. And now back to my interview with Earl Marshall. you've been able to walk alongside a number of people in your years of ministry. You've also, I'm sure, had colleagues or people that you were at school with years ago. I'm just thinking about these different elements of the head, the experience, the connection of the heart. As you've reflected, and I'm sure you regularly do reflect on friends who are no longer in the pastoral vocation, maybe are saying, I'm no longer a follower of Jesus. How have you seen these three things needing to be a constant? Because I think sometimes people think, oh, I'll do education or knowledge at the beginning, and then it's just like experience, and then they get a sabbatical. They focus on their heart. But how do these three things, why is it necessary for these three things to be working in tandem?
I mean, this might sound overly simplistic, but for me, I just feel like the Christian life and ministry life is primarily a relational thing. And that's modeled all the way through Scripture. It's interesting how much, we give like the Apostle Paul so much press, right? Like it's amazing. But when you read through the book of Acts, you begin to realize, like he's traveling in team. Like it's not just him. There's Luke and there's Timothy and there's Titus and there's all these other people that he's engaged with that are traveling with him. So it's like, even with Paul, like even when you read his words, you tend to think, it's just coming, it's just coming from him, Well, it's not just coming from him. It's coming from, there's a team of individuals that are engaging with him. Like the Lord may have had, in a unique way, used the Apostle Paul for sure, but he was not isolated. And I think this is a fundamental issue that we deal with culturally, because we tend to be a highly individualistic culture. I think many of us have been taught that, and it's been modeled for us, that we're really dependent on ourselves and our own abilities to do things. And many of us carry this. I know I did. We carry that into ministry with us. And if we are not, we become susceptible to quitting and not persevering when we're not engaged with others and who are willing to push on us and press on us. It's not like the answer to everything, but I do think I found that most of the guys that started out in a certain direction and have decided to not continue in their faith journeys, at some point they isolated themselves and they cut themselves off of probably the people that they needed the most. They didn't allow them to push. They just said, I don't want to listen to you. I'm out.
For you, where have you found those relationships over the years? Where have you pursued those relationships? Because I think someone would say, I'd love that, but I don't know where to get that right now. How have you pursued it, found it?
I think for me, it hasn't just been one person like my whole life, not the same person. So I've gone through different seasons in my life. At different seasons, the Lord has provided different people to help in that process. Some of it was around, like I can still remember the one guy and his wife that were really close to Brenda and I when we first got married. Well, we didn't, none of us had kids. We spent all this time with each other. It was easy. It was great, but we had a real significant impact. And then kids came. They moved out to Vancouver area. We stayed here in Ontario. So it's like you kind of mourn the loss of that, but you realize, okay, it's all right. The Lord's going to supply some other people, and that's what he did. Like I think when I worked at the seminary, I had some really unique and close relationships with some of the other profs and their spouses, right? So we had good interaction with each other. When we went to the church, we were able to build some relationships internally, but then also develop some external relationships as well. So I would say this. So I think I do find a movement of pastors who feel like I can't trust anyone in my church. And like I get that like a lot, because there are times when you may feel like you can't. I mean, I'm not sure I can really open up to these people. I know I'm in a small group, but can I really open up with these people? Like, I totally get that. But I think just because it may be hard, it doesn't mean that we should abandon the local church. It would be hard. I would be very hard pressed to read through my Bible and come to the conclusion that, oh, I'm a pastor, I shouldn't have any meaningful relationships with the people in my church. I get the guardedness. I get the walls up kind of idea. I understand all that. But I am a little wary of people who say my accountability is totally external to the church. Probably because of the experiences that I've had in the last number of years with other leaders and hearing that message. And it is almost like code for, I'm not accountable here, I'm accountable out there. And yet Scripture tells us, no, you're actually accountable here. I do think we need to have outside voices that are speaking into our lives, but I do think we need to fight for the power of the local church as Christ has, allowed it to be described in the New Testament.
How would you counsel a pastor to do that well with his local church and with those who are part of it?
I would say start with your elders. I personally believe that that's one of the important parts of an elder leadership team. I believe in the plurality of eldership, and I think part of that's more like a culture kind of thing. Like rather than being equal, I think it's more of a culture plurality where you can really care for one another and invest in each other, hold one another accountable. I think the more time you spend with other leaders like that, even though I totally agree. Like, if you've never been a senior pastor or senior leader, you may not, you may not fully ever understand that. But at the same time, I think about all the guys that I have journeyed with over the years who have run their own businesses, and that's never stopped me from trying to invest in their lives and trying to understand my inability maybe to fully understand. But that doesn't mean I can't care for you and I can't try to understand. I mean, I can't tell you how many guys I've talked with and prayed with when they're about to make a major decision of their business, and they're saying stuff to me that I don't know what you're talking about, but so yeah, I do understand that as a senior leader in the church, everybody may not understand the pressures that you're going through or the weight that you're holding on to. But at the same time, I don't understand what everybody else is going through either. But God's called us to kind of care for one another. So that's always my counsel will start there. Like, as the Lord is bringing an elder team together in your church, look for creating an environment where you can actually truly try to care for one another. And there's no guarantees. Like, I mean, I've been in elder meetings where I've been accused and called different things, and I'm going, whoa, where did that come from? And then having to spend the next few weeks trying to work through repairing through that whole process. But I just feel like that, you have to ask yourself, what do you believe the local church is supposed to be like? What's a leadership team supposed to look like? It's hard, but it's worth it.
Share with us a story of it being worth it.
Wow. I think it's easier to think of the ones that didn't work out, right? I think for me, the two that I can think of, the situations have worked out because we had enough trust invested ahead of the crisis. The ones that haven't worked out for me have always been because I haven't invested in that person enough, or they haven't invested in me enough. I've found in almost every case when the relational tank is fuller, like you can actually say, okay, I don't understand why you just said what you said, and I don't understand why you did what you just did, but because, because we spent all this time together, and because we've been praying with each other for so long, because you've taken the time to care for my kids, and I've taken the time to care for your kids, and you've invested in my wife and I as a couple, and we've invested in you in that way. Because of that, I'm going to have to think it's worth it to fight for this. And it's almost always the other, like when that tank's not full, it's like, I don't know if that's when I say, I don't know if I have the energy for this. I almost always have the energy for the situations where I feel like this person loves, I don't understand what's going on, but they've expressed love for me. Like I have to, I don't get why I wouldn't fight for this.
Right. So what you're speaking to is the value. I think there's a word that you used there. We had enough trust before the crisis, which speaks to you've got to build the relationship, especially in good seasons, because inevitably a crisis will come and you're going to need the relational strength. I mean, isn't it a strong principle and a reality just with our relationship with Christ, where people typically, when things are good, aren't really building at times their defense system or building out the practices in their relationship with Jesus, and suddenly things get hard and they're like, oh my goodness, I can't get through this. And certainly it's difficult, but it's maybe indicative of the reality that they didn't invest that time earlier on. So what are some of the rhythms that you would encourage a leader with the leaders that they're raising up in their church? And here are some just disciplines in an annual calendar, in an annual year, that you can easily include that will help build the relational trust.
So I'd say this, start with a principle. I would say, if you're going to do this well, you're going to need to understand that the work of ministry is going to take a step back from the relationships of ministry. If trust is actually the glue that is going to kind of hold this together, then that means we're going to have to invest in activity with each other that might pull us away from being like effective, right? Or successful. So when you think about rhythms, then that would mean, well, we have to actually just spend time with each other, investing in relationships. So if you only spend time together at a meeting once a month, or whatever the frequency is that your leadership team gets together, if all we ever do is just talk about the work and that kind of stuff, that's not going to cultivate the trust factor. You've got to play together. You have to eat together. You have to pray together. You have to cry together. It might mean you're going to take you might have to take like a whole evening just kind of talking about, hey, this doesn't feel right. Help me, guy. Our relationships don't feel right here. Like, am I out to lunch here? Like, and you just have to that has to become a priority factor in your agenda, cultivating agendas for your meetings. Do at least one retreat a year where you're away for a day or a couple of days. I'd say an overnight thing would be really good. Make sure you're like, don't shy away from the fact that you're spending time with your key leadership team in a way that is, some people might think, oh, like, why do they get to do something? Like, how come they get to go to the Jays game and I don't get to go to the Jays game? I said, well, like, we're just trying to invest in each other.
That the unity of our team formed through relationship and trust is essential.
Yeah. So I would, like, to me, like, that's, like, the work is always going to be there. Like, it's like we're never going to, the Great Commission is never going to end until the Lord comes back. Right. So, like, that's, and I'm not in any way downplaying the importance of us to actually doing it. We have services that have to run. We have things like that have to get done. And we're just not, our team isn't just there to hang out. We're actually there's actually a mission that we're engaged in as well. I just think it's the idea that as you are on mission together, make sure you are investing in relationship with each other, because what's going to happen, guaranteed, somewhere along the way, as you're doing mission together, there's a bump that's going to hit in the road. And if you haven't invested in your relationships with one another, you could get totally sidetracked. And so God's just called us to that, right? Like that's that's what we're called to do and to be. I'd add another thing. I would encourage every senior leader, and when I mean senior leader, I would talk about not only in age, but also in position, that every senior leader try to invest in younger leaders. I'm finding surprisingly more and more with, this is one of the really big pluses of the next generation. They are hungry for investment. They want people that are older than them to actually take the time to invest in them. When I'm meeting with my guys on Monday nights, I don't know how they view me. Like, am I a cute little teddy bear or something? I'm not sure, but they have openly expressed a desire, like, we want that. We not want this. We need this. And I do think you begin to, when you do that, you begin to model with the next generation what truly is important. The fact that somebody older and maybe busier and with a greater level of responsibility than someone who is younger is taking the time to invest in somebody who's in their early 20s or late teens or things like that, you're modeling for them the importance of not only downloading information, but the building of relationships. And, as I've already said to the guys that I meet with, I said, listen, I'm not going to be on this earth much longer, but for the next X number of years, as you grow older, I'm going to be making sure that you are doing a 2 Timothy 2:2 kind of ministry, just like I'm doing a 2 Timothy 2:2 ministry with you now. So I do think that helps a lot when it's modeled. When I was growing up, the relational side of ministry was not modeled. It was about the work, and it's not that relationships weren't formed, but it just wasn't that intentional. That was the generation that I grew up in, and that was a weakness, right? And it reflected very much the way that families operated during that time as well, and that was a weakness. And we need to learn from that and not duplicate that anymore.
Earl, thank you for taking the time and investing in this podcast and sharing with us. I think this is deeply important, and I think this is going to bless a lot of people. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks.
As always, I'm sure you would agree that there is much from this conversation with Earl Marshall that could be applied as this episode's action step. The thing that I want to give emphasis to, however, is when Earl talked about the integral and the great importance of leaders building relationship with one another, and that being a primary purpose of an elder's ministry or a leadership team's ministry to the church. That when times of conflict or difficulty arise, and surely they will as we live in a broken world with broken people, that the elders will have the trust to be able to trust one another, to be able to love one another, to have the relational rapport, to believe that the person sitting across the table or across the living room from them actually has the church's best interests in mind. And again, that there is that trust built prior to that conflict. Well, friends, as always, I hope you've been challenged by this episode, inspired and encouraged and equipped. Why don't you go ahead and share this right now so that you don't forget. Thanks as always for listening. And now here's a clip from my conversation that will be released next with Brandon Richardson on Base Church in Kitchener, Waterloo.
And that's actually how I would describe. We were side by side looking at the same thing going, we believe God's leading us to this. And it just made the conversation so much easier because it didn't feel like we were just advocating for our side. But you're two different people and you are wanting to make sure that this is the healthiest decision for the people that you're leading and shepherding. And so any tension just came out of understanding that the other side, or the one beside you, was simply trying to do the best for the people they were currently leading. Yes, we're trying to answer this question: how do we lead both congregations better into the future? But right now, we are currently responsible for groups of people. Let's have their best interests in mind.